I have the pleasure of welcoming you to this award ceremony at IVA. My name is Anders Broström. I'm the director of the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum. The Entrepreneurship Forum connects academia, policy and business in meetings that make a difference. Our ambition is to be a leading source of reliable and useful research-based knowledge concerning economic policy. And we initiate, carry out and communicate policy-relevant research on economic renewal, entrepreneurship and innovation. And we seek to promote research on innovation and entrepreneurship. And we promote the dissemination of important research in these fields. In order to accomplish that, part of our work is to organize 2 annual prizes. We have the Young Researcher Award, which will be awarded to Claire Ingram Bogers later this year. We're looking forward to that, Claire. Well, we also have the senior prize, so to speak, and that is the Global Award for Entrepreneurship Research. That is organized in collaboration with IFN and Vinnova. The winner of this prize receives a prize sum of 100,000 euro and the statuette The Hand of God by Carl Milles. And this is only made possible by generous donations of the prize sum, and the donator is Lars Baxell. Lars, why do you support entrepreneurship research in this generous way?
Thank you, Anders. I think you can go back. I graduated from the Stockholm School of Economics 40 years plus. It's fabulous that it happened. At the time, I think we were 2 out of 220 students that took a different path, namely to look into small businesses. At the time, there was no research, there was no inspiration, there was no guiding whatsoever in this area that we are talking about today. I have the privilege of having 2 daughters that has recently graduated. Every of their friends, everyone, actually is talking about starting up, getting a new business running, being an entrepreneur. So something has happened during these years, these 40 years. And I think a driving force in that respect is actually that there's been a lot of very inspiring, interesting research showing more of what entrepreneurship is all about. And that is a very, very important topic. That is one of the reasons. The other one is when you look at, we're actually now placed here in IVA, the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. I'm not an engineer, but I'm a fellow of this organization. I was the business council chairman for some 15 years ago. At the time, IVA had something like 200 plus companies in the business council as members. They were all the blue chips of the world. There was not one small company. And of course, by that, no one actually spoke about the interesting elements and the topics that was necessary to drive and foster these kind of companies. So what I did actually was that I changed the threshold for the tariff. So instead of 200,000 to be member here, it ended up with 5,000. And we got 40 new members. And out of those 40 new members, suddenly there was a pressure on the organization to come up with a program, which of course was the game plan. So suddenly we were forced to have something to talk about. And that initiated, not only that, but of course, as a one piece, the idea of that there was something here that we needed to discuss and develop and also have a certain research and projects around. The consequence of that was that in 2019, which was the 100 years celebration of IVA, and you have to think about this organization, which was one of the first in the world in this respect, turned around and they got 250 million SEK in donations for future activities. The major part of that is devoted to entrepreneurship. That happened in 15 years. And that is a big thing, if you think about it, because that also brings us to talk about what it is all about, namely the research and development in this area. So when you think about it, what we have today is a totally different environment, another scenario, and this in itself brings knowledge, competence, and skills. And it's so important to drive this area, the entrepreneurship area, also from an academic perspective. That was a long answer to your question, but I hope you learned something, right?
Thank you very much. Today is indeed a celebration of entrepreneurship research. And entrepreneurship research in itself celebrates and acknowledges entrepreneurship. And in that spirit, we have the pleasure of inviting Gunilla von Platen up on stage. Gunilla, as I'm sure you know, is an entrepreneur, an investor, a philanthropist, and a co-partner at Transcom Worldwide. And we'll switch language for this discussion to our own mother tongue, to my mother tongue, and to our joint language. Gunilla, som entreprenör...
Var ska vi stå? Här? Eller vad vill du ha mig? Här?
Här är rummet, utmärkt. Vår pristagares forskning handlar om hur entreprenörer fattar beslut. Och inte minst om hur entreprenörer fattar beslut för att nå framgång i sitt entreprenörskap. Hon beskriver hur vi har begränsade möjligheter att agera efter detaljerade planer och på lång sikt uppgjorda detaljplaner. Och istället måste improvisera. Hur stämmer den bilden med dina erfarenheter av entreprenörskap?
Men först vill jag säga att det är fantastiskt kul att få vara här. Stort tack för att jag får äran att vara här idag. Och sen skulle jag säga att den stämmer väldigt väl överens med min entreprenörsresa. För att när jag startade för 22 år sedan så hade jag ju ingen aning vart jag riktigt var på väg. Om någon hade frågat mig, eller sagt till mig för 22 år sedan att om 22 år har du 32 000 anställda i 27 länder, då hade jag trott att de var totalt galna. Så att man börjar med någonting. Och sen under resans gång så märker man att det där var fel. Om du springer åt det hållet och sen var det rätt. Och sen adderar jag på någonting. Och sen säger jag, den delen var inte så bra, utan jag ser att det här är mer den lönsamma modellen. Så att man får lösa saker under resans gång. Så jag tror inte på att du har en 5-årsplan eller 10-årsplan och så följer den blint. För det är inte så det funkar i entreprenörskapet.
Så hur agerar man mellan att planera och att improvisera? I vilka finns det situationer där man ändå måste ha en långsiktig plan? Eller handlar det om att improvisera till största biten?
Nej, men jag tror att du måste ju ha en plan. Du vet ju vad du ska och vilken marknad och allt det där. Och du har gjort din analys. Men jag tror inte att du kan planera alldeles för långt framåt. För du måste vara beredd att omrevidera din plan under resans gång. Och jag vet inte hur många gånger som jag har omreviderat min plan. För att omvärlden förändras. Mina kunder förändras. När jag startade med kundtjänst för 22 år sedan, nummer 1 var det ju inte ens någon som brydde sig om kundtjänsten. Den som inte dög till någonting annat placerades på kundtjänsten. Medan 22 år senare så inser alla att kundtjänsten är hjärtat i ett företag. Och då var det typ samtal och mejl. Idag hjälper vi kunden med hela den digitala resan. Från A till Ö med AI och allting. Och där måste jag som entreprenör skifta om och hänga med i utvecklingen av tekniker och med mina kunder.
I vår pristagares forskning så visas också mycket på hur de mest värdefulla kunskaperna ofta handlar om vad man inte bör göra, vad man inte bör gå, hur man inte bör agera snarare än exakt hur man bör göra. Är det någonting som stämmer med dig? Och jag tänker också på att du som coachar ganska många framgångsrika yngre entreprenörer, nya entreprenörer. Är det den typen av insikter som dina samtal kan handla om? Eller kan du också peka på dem vad de borde göra i vissa situationer?
Jag tror att det handlar om både och. Att när jag coachar mina entreprenörer som jag investerar i, så självklart vill jag dela med mig om mina erfarenheter och mina misstag. Det är ju jättebra om de slipper göra samma misstag. Men sen tror jag ju också på att du måste göra misstag som en entreprenör. För det är också mina misslyckande och misstag som har tagit mig framåt. Så när man säger ibland att men nu går jag på min magkänsla, det här känns bra. Men vad är magkänslan? Det är inte så att det känns bra i magen idag. Alltså det handlar om en enorm erfarenhetsbank med alla mina år i min entreprenörsresa som finns där i huvudet. Som bara snabbt ploppar. Det här känns rätt eller det här känns fel. Och de gångerna man går ifrån den där känslan, då blir det oftast fel. Så man ska lita på den där magkänslan.
Gunilla, du får man säga har blivit ett ansikte verkligen för entreprenörskap i Sverige. Hur är det med bilden av entreprenören och entreprenörskap i Sverige? Upplever du att dagens svenskar har en rimlig bild av vad det innebär att vara entreprenör och vilka entreprenörerna är? Finns det missuppfattningar som vi...
Ja, då är det snabba svaret nej. De har inte rätt uppfattning om hur det är att vara entreprenör. När jag startade för 22 år sedan, då var det definitivt inte fint att vara entreprenör. Och då ska man komma ihåg, min första sajt var i Skellefteå. Jag var den första typ invandrartjejen som kommer från Skellefteå, från Göteborg, dit upp, starta företag. Det fanns knappt entreprenöriella företag. Idag är Skellefteå the shit, förlåt mig språket, men det är ju det med Northvolt och alla som vill vara där, så nu är det mycket hetare. Men att vara entreprenör, när jag träffar ungdomar på skolorna så tror de att det är enkelt. De kan komma till mig och säga att jag vill äga min tid. Jag vill kunna ha fritid. Det är ju superhäftigt att vara entreprenör, för då får man bestämma allting själv. Och då säger jag till dem, då får du nog gå hem och tänka om. För att vara en entreprenör, det är en livsstil. Det är blod, svett och tårar. Det finns ingen glamour. De tror ju att det är enkelt. De ser så här Spotify-miljarder och grejer. Det är det inte. För en vanlig entreprenör, för den stora massan, så är det blod, svett och tårar och självklart häftigt under resan. Men du lever med ditt företag dygnet runt, 7 dagar i veckan. Det är, man andas och lever sitt bolag.
Det är ett hårt arbete. Behöver vi fler som gör det arbetet?
Absolut. För det jag tycker att vi pratar mer entreprenörskap i Sverige, men om vi tittar på fakta på siffrorna så har vi inte blivit så jättemycket bättre ändå. Så vi pratar mer än vad vi levererar. Så om man frågar ungdomarna så är det många som säger att de kan tänka sig att bli entreprenörer. Men hur många som sen blir det är en helt annan femma. Och där brukar jag också säga att jag tror att vi har det för bra i det här landet. Man är för lat och bekväm. För du behöver inte vara entreprenör, som i USA till exempel. Men när jag är ute så säger jag att är det någonstans i världen ni ska kunna vara entreprenörer, då är det Sverige. För går du åt skogen så har ni det bästa skyddsnätet ever. Så det är bara att köra.
Finns det någonting vi kan göra, vi som gärna skulle vilja se gott entreprenörskap, för att få fler att ändå ta på den här svåra uppgiften? Jag tror väldigt mycket på att lyfta fram förebilder och att man visar att det är möjligt och att det går. Och förebilder inom alla kategorier, inte bara viss kategori. Tjej, killar, unga, äldre, alltså allt. Jag tror väldigt mycket på mentorskap och att finnas där för andra. Därför jag är mentor åt många unga entreprenörer. Det var faktiskt det som till slut efter 6 månaders tjatande att jag fick. Till slut sa jag ja till att göra The Apprentice, som är en tv-serie som Donald Trump gjorde. Och det handlar ju egentligen om att lyfta entreprenörskapet och visa att det är möjligt. Kan vi lära folk att bli entreprenörer på något sätt? Ja, det är en jättebra fråga och jag är övertygad om att det är flera som kommer säga emot mig här. Men i min värld och min övertygelse så är det så att jag kan inte göra vem som helst till en entreprenör. Jag har 4 barn. Och jag kommer aldrig kunna göra dem till entreprenörer. För att vara en entreprenör så måste du ha vissa egenskaper som person. Kunskap kan jag ge dig, men jag kan inte ge dig egenskaper. Och vi entreprenörer, vi är ju lite galenpannor. Vi är ju totalt orädda. Vi ser ju möjligheter där ingen annan som är förnuftig kan se de här möjligheterna. Och det är ingenting som du kan lära dig på skolbänken. Det tror jag inte, utan du måste ha en viss personlighet. Och du kan inte vara en trygghetsnarkoman, för då ska du definitivt inte bli entreprenör, för det finns ingen trygghet i det. Kan jag som inte är entreprenör lära mig någonting, och i så fall vad av framgångsrika entreprenörer? Ja, det tror jag absolut. Och det är jättebra att inte alla vill heller bli entreprenörer, för vi behöver duktiga medarbetare, vi är entreprenörer. Och det jag brukar säga till alla mina ledare, det värsta jag vet är när de inte vågar fatta beslut. Så våga fatta beslut. Och det är helt okej att misslyckas. Gör om och gör rätt. Men det är bättre det än att du bara förvaltar och aldrig gör någonting och inte kommer någon vart. Och det är precis som vi entreprenörer gör. Jag menar, om jag och min man ska fatta 10 beslut. Min man är en blå personlighet, analytisk. Av 10 beslut så fattar han 3. Och de är väl grundade, ordentliga och de blir rätt. Jag fattar 10. 2 går åt helvete. Men det är helt okej. Men jag har åtminstone fattat 10. Gunilla, du har på många sätt genom Draknästet och The Apprentice och genom coacha och genom att du agera för entreprenörskap jobbat för att göra Sverige mer entreprenöriellt. Vad är dina steg härnäst?
Det är en jättebra fråga, men jag kommer fortsätta i den här andan. Jag brinner så mycket för entreprenörskapet. Och jag åker ju runt på skolor med Prince Fellowship och IVA och försöker inspirera dagens ungdomar om att vilja bli entreprenörer. Jobbar också mycket i förorten där vi visar dem att allt är möjligt. Kan jag som flykting komma till Sverige med 2 tomma händer och bygga ett bolag, så kan vem som helst i Sverige.
Tack så mycket,
Tack.
Gunilla.
Tack.
Tack så mycket. And now I have the honor of welcoming the chairman of the prize committee, Professor Martin Andersson, on stage to present us with the nomination and the motivation for the prize.
Absolutely. Thank you, Anders. So, the prize committee has decided to give the 2022 Global Award for Entrepreneurship Research to Professor Sarasvathy based on the following motivation. So Professor Sarasvathy's research has fundamentally changed and invigorated the conversation in the domain of entrepreneurship research. Her work on effectuation emphasizes how entrepreneurs operate based on available resources, think in terms of affordable loss rather than profit maximization, leverage trustworthy partnerships, and treat unforeseen contingencies as opportunities rather than problems. It has led and inspired a new generation of researchers in the quest for a better understanding of how entrepreneurs make their decisions and the unfolding of the entrepreneurial process. As an originator, driving force, and ambassador of entrepreneurship research, Professor Sarasvathy embodies all those qualities instrumental for maintaining entrepreneurship as a vigorous, impactful, and practically relevant domain of research. So Professor Sarasvathy, welcome on stage to receive the prize. Congratulations.
Thank you, Martin.
And this one.
Thank you. Am I supposed to do something with it?
Well, we can just stand like this, I think.
All right. Thank you.
We are going to have the pleasure of listening to Professor Sarasvathy's prize lecture in just a few minutes. But we do have a small surprise before that. A number of colleagues who couldn't be here today wanted to share their appreciation for Professor Sarasvathy and her work. So they have chosen to do that in the form of a film greeting. This is for you.
Goodness. Thank you.
When we started, this is almost 20 years ago, when my dissertation work came out and I was teaching in University of Washington, Nick Dew, Rob Wilbonk, and Stuart Reed, who were all in different doctoral programs, we began working together. And in a strange way, the 3 of them challenged me to think about effectuation, the idea of effectuation, and our research also effectually. So they said, let's try to build this effectually. And the ultimate test of effectuation is if we apply the principles to our own research, only if the idea is valuable and other people want to co-create the idea with us, something will happen. And I'm glad we did it that way. And our time together today is a result of that. This idea of co-creating the future with people who want to work with you actually worked. So that is what really convinced me about effectuation and not just my dissertation.
This is Stuart Reed at Multnomah Falls in Oregon's Columbia Gorge. Saras, you climb to the top of these falls the same way you climb to the top of your entrepreneurship research game. One thoughtful, determined, carefully placed step at a time. Well done.
How unlikely this probably all was at the beginning, and you know, there would have been a few people who you know, would have shown the kind of grit and determination that you've shown all the way through.
With Saras, the reward really is the journey. It's an intellectual but also a human reward, because although Saras is one of the sharpest academics I know, she's also probably the nicest and I would say the most human.
A highlight of all of my years in academia was getting to work with you. You bring enthusiasm to your work in ways that nobody else does.
I also witnessed the fascinating journey, the labor of love that you poured into it, the growth in the effectuation community, the evolution of the idea itself. It's been a great joy to witness all this over the last 2 decades.
I'd like to extend my congratulations for this award. Very, very timely recognition of the amazing work that you have done in the field of entrepreneurship. I'd also add that it probably comes as no surprise to anyone who has met you, has worked with you, interacted with you in all capacities.
There are people who are intellectual, there are people who are curious, there are people who are mindful, and there are people who are brave. Saras is a rarity who lies in the intersection of intellectual, mindful, curious, and brave.
What impresses me most? Her availability, her disposition to participate in events and projects, her profound wish to build connections and improving our world through the tools of effectuation.
She doesn't shy away from a heated discussion, and she will definitely tell you what she thinks, but always with the passion and love burning inside of her for what she is doing and what we are all doing as effectuation scholars and educators.
Saras is a person full of joy, and her generosity is a lesson for all of us.
Saras, your sharp mind, curiosity, and passionate spirit to learn, teach, and apply knowledge to action are a blessing which you generously share open-handed with everyone around.
With effectuation, Sarasvathy has codified an important piece of knowledge that helps us cope with a world full of uncertainty and opportunity.
As a solo bootstrap founder at an early stage startup, I face uncertainty on a daily basis.
I had been an entrepreneur before Darden, but operated without a framework, and did not see the patterns that are taught in effectual thinking. Taking Sarah's class was an eye-opening experience.
It opened a surprising box to see the world from different angles and creating realities which affect the design and construction of my own DBA thesis.
Your work completely turned around both the content and the operating system of my work as a professional consultant in the last 15 years.
Then once a student said to me, "Oh, so effectuation means sometimes you win, sometimes you learn."
And I feel everyone follows the principles of effectuation knowingly or unknowingly in their lives.
As a washed-up corporate strategist, I was tired of spinning Rubik's Cube to solve complex problems. Saras's work gave me hope to seek new ways of co-creating step by step with an energetic community of effectuators. She has been a great inspiration to take action in spreading effectuation education.
I feel inspired by your work, especially your writing. Every time I feel a little bit down, I go back to your papers to get inspiration.
The inspiration that drives entrepreneurs and innovators to get started.
Congratulations, Saras. After I met Saras, my research life has been changed.
Through her personal guidance and mentorship, I was able to understand deeply how the effectuation principles can help people to understand that they are able to make new worlds.
Professionally and personally, Dr. Saras has been a great influence and a firecracker, as we like to call her. May she enlighten many more souls in her path.
Feeling of friendship and community of energy and enjoyment of life that I share with you.
It's not just the quality of her work and her theorizing, but also her engaging and witty writing that make her a truly outstanding scholar in my eyes, as well as her big heart and commitment to community.
Effectuation has changed my life. Thank you so much for sharing yourself and your scholarship so freely with the world.
We and my colleagues at NSRCL and IIMB are extremely delighted to be associated with Saras and be influenced and inspired by her in all our activities to promote entrepreneurship.
I've also founded a center that is the Social Entrepreneurship Hub in Ghana that is teaching entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and effectuation to businesses in the formal and informal sector.
The great impact that effectuation is having in this region.
Now, anyone who is good enough with a not so great or blockbuster idea can become an entrepreneur. This idea alone, Professor Saras' work alone, has unleashed hundreds, if not thousands, of grassroots entrepreneurs in Malaysia.
On behalf of your friends in Croatia, I want to thank you for your ability to integrate different thoughts, pieces of knowledge from everywhere into a meaning of being responsible for making this world better for the people and for the planet.
So I give my talk.
Please, Professor, the stage is all yours.
All right. I was determined not to get emotional and to be like a true intellectual, but it may or may not work. So bear with me here. I'm going to try to remember what I was going to present. Thank you so much. And I cannot thank you all enough in this room who give of your time, and sometimes it's a thankless task to do this, so it's a delight to be here. Definitely, oh, do we need to get this started? Sorry about this. Technology. Can't live without it, but very often can't live with it. I can talk without it if needed. I can have a sip of water. Yay, we got it. Thank you so much. Now, if you could also make me taller, That would be very useful.
Could you try the...
Yeah, sure. I think you just need to click once and then it should work. I think if you click, yeah, just in the middle, yeah. Oh no, to go back.
There you go. Try it one more time.
Yes,
Yes.
that works. Okay, thank you so much. So definitely this is a moment of joy and gratitude. Whenever any work gets recognition of this kind, right? Surely there are dozens, as you saw. I'm glad they came with me, and you brought them with me here. Dozens, if not hundreds of people who have contributed to that work. So as I was preparing this lecture, I was trying to make a list, and of course it's a very long list. So I decided maybe I will just mention one or two names, and you already met them in the videos that I did not know would be presented. But first and most important of all is my comrade in arms, entrepreneur and professor, Stuart Reed, or as Nick and Rob and I would call him Sarge, because he would keep things moving on, data collection, measurement, let's finish the textbook, and organizing effectual dinners at conferences and things like that. And my time and conversations with him it's unmatched, except maybe for my husband and writer, Anil Menon, whose conversations I enjoy, and he's been part of my intellectual journey as well. And my colleague, Venkat Venkatraman, that you saw, he's at the Darden School. He's one of those people who worked tirelessly for, I think, 18 years as editor of the Journal of Business Venturing, and he took a ragtag bunch of enthusiasts like me and actually built the basis for entrepreneurship to be recognized as an intellectual discipline on its own, and it's a privilege to call him a friend. And also, Sweden is kind of dear to me because the very first invitation I got out of the US when the dissertation was completed was to Jönköping. Per Davidsson and then Magnus Aronsson brought me to Stockholm. And so Sweden has invested in my journey throughout the last 20 years or so as well. So lots of people to thank, moment of gratitude for sure. But as we think about these things and we look at people in the room here who helped build the academic enterprise, and we have this moment of celebration, I also look around the room and I see a lot of people, maybe thousands of people, who are not here and will never get here. Not because they're not smart enough or didn't work hard enough, but just some lottery did not happen for them, right? It could be that you were just 2 marks short of getting that scholarship to go to college, or it could be that somebody didn't open the door for you at the right time, or some life event happened that prevented you from being able to accomplish your best. So I remember them, and I think of them, and I see them in some ways because I know them personally. They are my mom, my sisters, former employees, and students, and even entrepreneurs in different parts of the world. So on their behalf, what I would like to do, and I decided to do, was not to see this award as a reward for past accomplishments, but to see it as an opportunity for us to think together on what to do next. So as Sarge would say, let's get on with it, shall we? So here goes. This is Jamshedji Tata. He passed away in 1904. He's the founder of the Tata Iron and Steel Company. And he did not live to see the company formed in 1907. But he started work on this venture in 1882 when he chanced upon a report by a German geologist on iron deposits in India. So this man had already built successful companies in textiles, luxury hotel, And yet he decided to choose to spend the last 2 decades of his life working on an unlikely venture in iron and steel. And that is not very easy to explain. And yet, it is not that uncommon. You see that in the histories of, Josiah Wedgwood in the 18th century, or even Elon Musk and Jack Ma today. So when we think about the story behind this, the story of entrepreneurship, one of the things you want to think about it is a lot of our predictive models actually don't explain decisions of this kind, right? So the story of entrepreneurship is full of chance encounters and goose chases. It's also full of heroic moments that are intermixed with really silly follies and epic fails of every kind. And so when you start thinking about that part of it, but you also think that it is a story of hard work, and a lot of the hard work consists in building relationships inside and outside your networks, and then organizing those relationships into something that is of value and endures in the world and produces more value as it exists, right? So there is both these aspects of entrepreneurship that we have to make sense of if we have to understand this. And from a decision perspective, when you look at it, neither the success after the fact, nor the wisdom or the judgment to start the venture in the first place can be explained purely through predictive models of the world. And for that, you actually need an effectual approach, right? And so that's what we have been working on for the last 20 years. So what is an effectual approach? I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining all that here, but I do need to touch the highlights, which is an effectual approach basically embraces uncertainty, right? It's not an approach that sees uncertainty purely as a problem. It sees it both as an ingredient and an outcome of our efforts to deal with uncertainty. And this is a little counterintuitive because our normal view of uncertainty is that we battle with it and we have to overcome it in some way. And the stories of entrepreneurship shows that chance and uncertainty continue to play a role even after you succeed. So the central question that could be of use to us as we think about what we can learn from entrepreneurship for application to other things in the world and the big problems of the world, one of the things I would like to pose today as a central question is that thanks to science, we increasingly have the power to literally shape our future without understanding what we want that future to be, right? This is sort of the central problem that I like to pose today here a little bit. Moreover, at the societal level, faced with all the challenges that we are faced with, we continue to think that we can actually get together and agree on goals ahead of time, not only goals, but budgets of human and financial capital ahead of time before we act. And clearly, something does not make sense there, right? So we want to think about the fact that we have, as we create more and more ways to achieve the things we want, we also figure out ways to disagree on what we could, should, and will want as we go along. So when you look at the problem more carefully, it becomes this problem of what is it that we actually want. We may not know that, but we also are not agreed upon on what we should want or even could want. So what is worth wanting is something that I discuss with my students and with colleagues, and we've been working on this question a little bit more. So one consensus out there is the answers to our question of what is worth wanting. We definitely cannot rely on things that we used to rely on the past, because in the past, because they don't work, like ancient texts, instincts from evolution, random preferences that we have no control over, But these are our explanations as of today for why we might want what we want. But what about kind of a rational idea of understanding and coming to concurrence on what we want? Even that doesn't work very well because of multiple uncertainties. So if you add multiple uncertainties to this thing, this becomes a much bigger problem. In fact, the better we do, the better worlds we build in some ways, the more people we get out of education and bring into prosperity, in a strange way, this problem actually gets worse. So let me give an example. Why science and history and all the knowledge in the world is just not enough to solve the problem. So this example is just look at 20th century here, right? Why knowledge is not enough. So if you look at the 20th century, and this is a very simple example, hopefully current, and this has to do with vaccine development, right? 20th century, we had so many different vaccines for so many diseases. And so as a result of that, when you go to like even the first decade of the 21st century, vaccine hesitancy was pretty close to zero. There are a couple of articles in medical journals that show. And then suddenly, for some reason, this thing started increasing. And this was before COVID, right? And nobody quite knows why vaccine hesitancy started increasing. But then in the face of a vaccine that we had already invented for dealing with COVID, 77% of the US population expressed vaccine hesitancy. Okay, that's just the US. Not very rational, we could say that. But it turns out that this was not a problem only in the US. The World Health Organization listed vaccine hesitancy as the top 10 global health problems in the world. And so in multiple places, this is a problem. So knowledge doesn't seem to quite get us there, even in something very obvious like a global pandemic, right? And this really blew my mind, right? Thousands of Germans are migrating to Paraguay, and they are unvaccinated Germans. A large proportion of them are unvaccinated Germans, and many of them are migrating to Paraguay illegally. Now, even if some of the other things could be explained, this just blew my mind. So we have to think about this thing, like what is going on here and why is it so difficult is something to think about. So there are several difficulties with goals, right? First thing is we may not know what we want. We may not agree what we want, right? So there's lots of conflicts in goals, and you have to think about, can we trade them off? How do we get to any kind of concurrence at all? And then there is the problem that when we do agree and achieve the goal, it has unintended consequences that we have to then deal with. And this is what the insight from effectuation research is, that uncertainty is both ingredient and outcome. It's not a problem to be solved in the traditional sense of the word. So, okay, I'm hoping everybody is not like totally depressed yet, but, and I plan to depress you a little bit more before getting you out of the tunnel here. And we may never get out of the tunnel, and that's okay too. So entrepreneurs learn this the hard way, right? They think, they're taught all kinds of rational, predictive ways to make decisions. And they go out, and when they start building the venture, they start realizing sometimes that they themselves do not know what they want, but that want changes over time. And definitely when they're talking to stakeholders and other people, who wants what is difficult to predict. It's difficult for, sometimes the customers will tell you they want it and then they will not buy it. So this thing of being able to predict what people will want is a problem that entrepreneurs encounter on a daily basis almost. So let's think about, who can help us understand what is worth wanting if we, leave out things like ancient texts and just the instincts from biology and stuff like that. So the logical place to turn is, of course, science, right? But for the most part, we keep the idea of value outside the scope of science for the simple reason that science is about explaining how, not why. So the science turns questions of value into questions of causation in some ways. And that takes away some of the most important problems that we need to tackle. There is more work being done in different sciences now to come to grips with some of these problems. But traditionally, science is sort of out of this situation. So consider physics, right? They'll tell you everything about how the universe came to be and where it's headed billions of years from now, but they cannot tell you why it works that way in some ways. Why is the universe what it is? Same with biology. It can tell you about species, but it cannot tell you why life is worth living. And of course, the economists, we just take preferences as given, and we have no good way of even thinking about how they are formed into utility functions. We have figured out ways to extract them from people, but the explanations are still, wanting a lot. And at the same time, entrepreneurship scholars and entrepreneurs cannot escape this question. Because they're in the business of shaping purposes. And I'm going to show you how that works in 1 second here. But I also want to make sure that we don't get confused. So the idea of entrepreneurship here is not to say, does not prescribe what is worth wanting, right? So that's the job of like ethics and moral philosophy and things like that. So that's not what I am suggesting entrepreneurs do. It also does not explain why, some people find something worthwhile and other people find other things worthwhile or not. That's the job much more of politics and psychology, and to some extent philosophy as well. But entrepreneurship, however, this is the really interesting part that we have tried to explain over the last 2 decades, which is it is a method for actually formulating both preferences and values and the achievement of those concurrently. So you don't have to do one ahead of time before you actually achieve it. So it is through action that you build both value and the idea of what is worth valuing in the process. So let's look at, what do we know about that? And this is just one slide I have for 20 years of research in some ways, to give you the theory first and then the evidence in another slide. So the key insight from the experiences of expert entrepreneurs was basically the recasting of prediction and control, right? So when you look at 3 kinds of uncertainty under which a lot of entrepreneurs operate, which is the future is not only unknown, but unknowable. This comes from Frank Knight, so the Knightian uncertainty. And people often do not know what they want, that is goal ambiguity. And then you see that there's another problem here, isotropy, which is information is not only not useful, information can completely disorient you. Because when you have a lot of information and you're not quite sure what you want and you cannot predict the future, it's not clear what information is relevant and what is not relevant for a particular course of action or a decision that you're facing. So this is like this triple whammy problem that we have to solve through effectuation. And the way you do it is say, science teaches you the better you predict, the better you can control outcomes. Sometimes you can even control some of the variables that drive the outcomes in some ways. Experienced entrepreneurs sort of go the other way. They split prediction and control apart. So they're basically rearranging the relationship between prediction and control and saying, if you actually separate prediction and control, sometimes you can make decisions without any predictive information whatsoever, and you can transform control itself into a strategy. And the process through which we do that, and this is just one version of this process diagram. This is kind of mine because someday I did it and then I keep using it everywhere. But there are multiple versions of this that other people have done, enhancement, changes. People have quarreled with it as well. All of it is available in the journal articles. But this is kind of the simple process that I talk about, where you start with who you are, what you know, and whom you know. Basically, you're dividing the world into things within your control, things outside your control. And you start with things that are already within your control. And then instead of trying to predict, risk-adjusted cash flows and choose, higher expected return, you just simply try to keep the downside within your control. You say, what can I do for affordable loss? Given that I'm willing to give it $20,000, maybe 6 months, or not even 6 months, 6 months of nights and weekends, what kinds of things can I do? So that's day one. And almost immediately, you start interacting with other people. And at every interaction, you're not just gathering some information or advice, although you can do that as well. The effectual entrepreneur is actually gathering commitments, getting people to put real skin in the game. And depending on who invests what with you, both the means and the goals change. And things that are outside your control also hit you. That's the lemonade principle. So you incorporate that into your bird in hand and affordable loss. And eventually, the process itself, the two cycles working together, leads you to not just what you thought you wanted to do. In fact, very often people end up building things that they'd never imagined they would do, right? So innovation is kind of built into the process if the process succeeds. So the idea here is not about probability of success or failure, but if success happens, probability of innovation is higher. And if failure happens, nobody loses anything more than they can afford to lose. And so the costs of failure are kept lower. And this is one of the things I think people find really useful way of thinking about uncertainty, not in terms purely of certain outcomes, but in terms of the process here. So how do you interact with people? So the last about more than 5 years, almost 7 years, many of us have looked into the details of how that commitment happens, right? So we actually look at how do you get people to self-select and commit real skin in the game, and it starts with something very simple. So this is like very, very micro idea of the ask. And I'll show you in a second how the ask allows you to navigate this prediction control space, not only effectually, but the whole space in some ways. And we have also shown how the ask is what you practice on a daily basis to becoming an entrepreneur. And the data for these comes from multiple studies, including a study of 250 small business owners. It's an experience sampling study where these small business owners called in 5 minutes a day for 60 days in a row to report what they were doing on the asks and things like that. So I'm not going to go into all of that, but just give you a glimpse of some of the practical aspects of what we are able to glean through research and show how you can learn to become an expert entrepreneur. So the standard way we think about it is you have to kind of know what you want, you have to know who you want to bring on board, you have targeted stakeholders, and you have to go tell them why they should actually invest with you, right? So most of entrepreneurship education is about the pitch. But that is actually just one kind of ask, and it is the ask in the visionary quadrant. The other end is where you're just trying to gather information and feedback and advice and information. It's an adaptive way of approaching this space. And all of these are important in entrepreneurship. It's not one over the other. It just tells you how it allows you to navigate and even build the space. And as you gather predictive information, if you want the kind of information that suggests some models of customer acquisition or investor acquisition and things like that, that will then feed into the pitch. So that is a causal approach to doing this. But the effectual approach is really to talk to anybody and everybody. You're not trying to predict who is the potential customer or investor. And you ask this question, what would it take for you? And that is what actually starts also changing the goals of the venture but it's not just information. So as one of the entrepreneurs said, information that comes with a commitment is the only actually valid information, especially if it comes with a commitment that makes my next action affordable loss for me, then it's a no-brainer. Then I have only got to decide whether to actually do it or not. And also your own judgment works throughout this process, and judgment is an important part of this process. So here are some confusions, when we think about entrepreneurship. So when we started presenting and writing, we would get a lot of comments like this in some ways, right? That they think about entrepreneurship as just like a subset of the invisible hand of the market. So in the early stages, economists would literally say, like, there ain't no such thing, as entrepreneurial expertise, right? Look at the failure rate. It's a statistical artifact. If enough idiots start enough companies, some of them will succeed and they will think they learned something. So that was the null hypothesis that we had to overcome in the early stages. And then there is a media narrative, I don't know if it's almost, we never ever portray any businessman or entrepreneur as somebody who's reasonable, who cares about themselves, their community, and the world, and tries to create value. When you look at it, they just have this idea of monopolistic practices of large organizations. That gets confused with entrepreneurship. Or it goes the other direction. There is some heroic entrepreneur out there who is a passionate individual and they change the world. So there's no room for real people actually doing any real ventures and in the process achieving really important things. So effectual entrepreneurship has been trying to change that narrative on all fronts and talk about a more nuanced reality that individuals can work in small groups and it's work. And we can tell you what do they do on a daily basis and how do they do it and how can we do that better and all of those kinds of things. So the evidence that has been gathered over the last 20 years comes from literally hundreds of scholars around the world. And people have studied everything from for-profit and non-profit, but also things like polycentric governance systems, art movements, how they happen, disaster relief, climate change, and recently there was an article published on how community entrepreneurship happens inside the native nation of Tokuat Nation. So the research has gone places and shown, and if we cannot change the narrative with this kind of research, I don't know what we are going to do, but I'm hoping today is another stepping stone in changing that narrative out there. But the message from this is that innovations in teleology are as important as innovations in technology. So one attitude people have to the large problem, the central problem that I presented, is that somehow technology is going to get us out of all these things, right? Whether it's climate change or anything else. So I want to show you a little bit about the kinds of teleologies or teleological innovations that we are going to need to be able to effectuate, if you will. So here is some of the issues that you have in teleology, right? That we have to think about, the kinds of futures we can build under existential threats. The future of work, leisure, and income is changing. The future of markets, states, money, future of freedom, fairness, and faith, future of mind, attention, and compassion. All of these are changing, and many of them are changing through technology. These are not just cultural things that are happening out there. So let's take a look at some of these very quickly, right? So a while ago, all of us were really worried about climate change, but now apparently disease and nuclear war is back on the table as an immediate threat, right? So we are doing that. So we have to think about how do you build a future, when you're living under existential threats. So one of the ways people think about it is technology. But I want to give you examples of just two technologies that I'm not sure whether they are helping or making the problems even more difficult. So you be the judge of that. So artificial intelligence. So the moment I say artificial intelligence, people will think about AlphaZero or big data or driverless cars or killer robots, of course. But how about AI-enabled friends for our kids? The kinds of questions that are coming with technology into who we are as a species and the things we want is something that is worth thinking about. Another one that I recently encountered is synthetic biology. Now, I got interested in synthetic biology through interest in climate change and the idea that we can make animal-free meat. And then it turns out that we can also create new species of viruses. And here is a really interesting kicker. There are high school competitions around the world for creating new kind of synthetic life forms. Why? Because the prices have gone down 1,000-fold. So anybody can order a kit from Amazon these days, and you can. So high school kids, for example, have created eau de coli, which is E. coli bacteria that doesn't smell, bad, right? So I'm not saying that these are all dangerous things that we have to be frightened of them. I'm saying these are just realities that are a part of what we are doing. And we are in the process of like re-engineering persons and societies. And my job here is to just to think through the role of entrepreneurship, and especially effectual entrepreneurship in some of these things. And so a few more examples here. I'm sure many of you might have read David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs. So in developed countries, a lot of us are working in jobs that I'm not sure is adding any value. So when I try to explain to my mom what I do, even though I think what I do is easier to understand in terms of value, my mom is like, I'm very glad I taught you how to cook, because this way you will not starve, no matter what happens, because you cannot understand why anybody would pay me anything to do that kind of work. So I offer my own job but the idea is we know, I think all of us know what David Graeber is talking about when he talks about bullshit jobs, right? And some of it is only going to increase due to AI, as AI becomes more successful in some ways. And then the issue of the division of labor, on which so much of the infrastructure of free market economics is built. We have to start thinking about that in many, many countries. If AI can do some of the value-creating jobs in some ways, then what is left over is jobs that human beings have to do for each other. So the job landscape is changing, and it's time to think about how does division of labor happen, and how does it connect with the wealth of nations in some ways. So this is another. And then, of course, in many places, people are thinking in the face of AI, maybe we have to think about universal basic income, and that is Milton Friedman out there. Similarly, let's think about markets, states, and money. And here I'm not only talking about things like geopolitics, but you can think about the role of the blockchain. Cryptocurrency, of course, everybody thinks is overhyped, and it may or may not work. But some of the other work that is going on in smart contracts and DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, a couple of us are doing like a little seminar with students on some of these things. And it's fascinating, not only because it's not just hype, but it's a way of thinking through new architectures for market relationships, but also for organizational structures that you can build. That's what smart contracts and DAOs can allow. So there's a lot of interesting things that are coming there, and they're connected with this idea of rearranging relationships in societies. And maybe this one, not so much rearranging persons as synthetic biology maybe, but still the concept of a person in a psychological sense is something we want to consider. And here is hopefully the last one, which is our understanding of the brain, which is one of my absolute fascinations. I try to keep up with the literature, whether it's neuroscience or psychology. And these are raising issues of, how much, how exactly does our mind work, and how does that translate into some of the decisions and things like that. So if we are going to build a society capable of like fairness and justice, what are we going to assume about the way the brain works and how it's linked to actual free judgment? So issues of how do we assign blame and responsibility in the face of our deeper understanding of mental health, for example, and morality and merit itself. Recently, there are 2 books that question the very idea of whether meritocracy is a valid value as well. So this is just to give you the richness of possibilities of problems that we can work on, right? So when we put all this together, I wanted to look at some of the things where prediction really does not work and breaks down, and we can contribute something interesting here. And so here, one of the things we want to start thinking about is a lot of recent work in entrepreneurship research sort of assumes that what entrepreneurs do is do hypothesis testing. And the data from Effectuation shows that that is not the case, right? If you're shaping the future, you're not just doing hypothesis testing, because the world is not going to just give you the answer, because very often the world doesn't know what the heck it wants. So confusing, we have to understand hypothesis testing is not market making. that polling is not governance, right? We use a lot of data, and then politicians decide what is it that we should be wanting, what is it that the voters want, instead of actually using their judgment and trying to also shape the opinions of their constituents in some ways. And investment does not equal innovation. All over the world, a lot of bright people, especially from technology, just assume that the aim is to get some VC funding, and then you're done, right? And it does not work that way. We know from studies of investments. So we have to remember that none of this actually gets rid of the need for individual ingenuity, crafty negotiations, creative competition, as well as co-creative or effectual coalition building. And we do not teach most of these in any level of education, and we may be wanting to think about teaching them much earlier than we do at the university level. So when you run out of ideas and new papers to write and new projects to do, what do? We come up with questions for future research, right? We set a research agenda. So I'm going to accept guilty as charged. I'm not ducking that is what is going on here. I have one foot in the grave. But I did want to use this opportunity to think about some things that we could do next. So I'm going to just offer 5 questions and then hopefully sit down. And the 5 questions are going to be based on each of the 5 principles. But they're not meant to be questions, and they can be addressed at any level of analysis, individual or state level or company level. But the idea here is to approach them like ventures that researchers can take up, but also policymakers and entrepreneurs and educators. So I'm seeing these as ventures that we could build in the future. One part of it is the intellectual aspect of the research. So let me walk you through these 5 very quickly. So the first question, and you'll see it is connected with all the problems that I already laid out here. What if the only scarce resource that we have is the human lifespan? Now, it's traditional, right, to think about all of economics as this, allocation of scarce resources to unlimited ones. But what about the inverse, which is what some of the technologies and even the economic achievements are pointing to in some ways? So now you may think this is only a problem for like the North, right, the developed countries. So I want to give you 2 examples at the individual level. This is not even a society question, from both parts of the world. These are people I have met, usually students and entrepreneurs. So here's one. I'm an only child. My parents' house is fully paid for and will eventually come to me. I have a great education. I'm in good health. I see some of my classmates have such passion for what they want to do. I don't seem to have such passion. How do I decide what to do with my life? I would love for you to think about what you would advise such a student. But you might think this is only in the North, so let me give you another example. I grew up in the slums. I took up music and mixed martial arts as a way to survive here. Recently, I was offered a fellowship to visit Europe and was stunned by the doors that opened for me. I would like to change the circumstances I grew up in, but I would also like to go back to Europe and help my family from there. I'm not sure what I should do, right? So we have actually opened gates for some people, and that also causes this question, what I call like a problem of plenty, right? So the idea here is not to prescribe any particular things that these people should be doing, but for us to start thinking about problems and ways of doing entrepreneurship and ways of building things both under abundance and under scarcity, right? So we need to broaden our horizon here a little bit. The next one I'd like to bring to you is the question of how to educate to move beyond loss aversion and myopic gain. So here, we know that both fear and greed are actually primal drivers from evolution. They've helped us survive. And the idea is not to say these are bad things, but these are very important for our survival. In some ways, we have leveraged these to build good societies as well. So the idea is not to fight them or give them up, but we do need to also, as we understand the mind and as we understand the biases that we have, we want to think about how do we move beyond that, just so that we can go beyond instinct to actual choice, conscious choice, right? So that's the motivation for this one here. So Jervis actually summarizes prospect theory, about loss aversion in a very nice way. I thought it's like the shortest summary I've seen of this. In summary, the theory argues that people tend to be risk averse for gains. This was generally known before, but simultaneously to be risk acceptant for losses. This was the surprise. Losses loom larger than gains. We all know that, right? Losing $10, you feel the pinch much more than if you gained $10. And that's the loss aversion prospect theory bias that we talk about. However, contrary to expected utility theory, right, the reference point from which you're starting is crucial. And so what happens is, more than the hope of gain, the specter of losses activates, energizes, and drives actors, producing great and often misguided efforts, that risk and eventually lead to greater losses. Just consider financial busts that happen over and over, these crises that happen over and over. And when you look at the data on this from an entrepreneurial perspective, people are still taught all the time somehow that high risk is intimately, not just that it is correlated with high returns, that also it's a necessary condition. So investors around the world accept the fact 9 out of 10 of my firms can fail. And I get all this money from institutional investors, and I'm going to place a bet because one of those 10 horses is going to come in 6,500 times the value, and that takes care of everything. And that may be okay in some cases, but when you look at the data from companies, you know that 70% of companies that even go public in the United States do not take any VC money, and many of them don't take any formal investment at all. So we need to be studying all ventures, right? Not just funded ventures. There's so much hype, both in research and in the media, on funding, and throwing money at things. So one of the things I want us to start thinking is to question that relationship between high risk and high return from data, but also more importantly, let's just collect data from people who are building great companies, creating great value, lasting for a time without enormous risky investment upfront. So this is kind of the standard model, if you will, very simplified. But when you take the affordable loss perspective, you can show, and we can show you dozens of examples of companies, both inside the tech sector and outside the tech sector, so-called unicorns, whatever your definition of a unicorn is, who actually, where they did not only they did not involve enormous high-risk funding, many of them did not even need high levels of funding at all. And the simple example there is Microsoft, right? When you ask who funded Microsoft, it's actually IBM. So there is a bunch of things to be studied there, and they all have to do with stakeholders who self-select into the process. So question number 3, am I way out of time already? Okay, I got hopefully 3 more slides to go. So here, the question about the connection between entrepreneurship and violence. When I first wrote this question, people were asking me, what do you mean? It kind of seems weird to think about entrepreneurship and violence in some ways, and why would that be relevant? And just today, thinking about what happened in Texas, I was thinking, I'm glad I included this in some way. And let's give you an example here. Right, so at the end of my courses, I ask my students, are you bullish on the human race? And even the optimistic ones will only be slightly more than 50% bullish on the human race. And then I'll show them Hans Rosling's data, right? That shows that, and there are 2 interesting things about this data. Not only is everyone sort of headed in the right direction in this thing, and there are every country of every kind of political persuasion out there. Right? So it doesn't seem to be just because you're in a bad political system, you're not going to head in the correct direction. So that was very counterintuitive. So we discuss this in class all the time. But it also shows, if I put it in motion, it will show you that the number 1 hindrance for progress happening is actually violence and war. It is not really just that. So you can say the political systems lead to the war. That's a other thing we want to think about. So a few of us have been thinking about the connection between, violence and entrepreneurship, and how an effectual approach, not just, incentivizing people through carrots and sticks or competition in the traditional sense of the word, but also some kind of, way of thinking about self-selection, thinking effectually about building channels where people can self-select out of violence. And one of the examples there is to think about, we have to get people to think of all of each other as partners in uncertainty in some way, right? How do I become a partner? How do I function? But how do I also ask somebody to be a partner in uncertainty? And this is a good example. In the late 90s, I think under Clinton, the US government took away funding for college education within prisons. And a bunch of undergraduates in a private university in the US created the Barred Prison Initiative. And it's a full degree. It's not just social service. There are professors involved, and they give a Bard degree, and they teach that. There is a lovely documentary you can take a look at. But the idea here is to show that there are entrepreneurial actions that you can take to solve some of these problems. Even with gun violence, we talk about market failure all the time, and we say that is the reason for government to act. But if you take something like gun violence in the US, there's market failure and there is government failure. And so how the heck are we going to tackle it is a question. And this one is a little bit personal here, that when something negative happens, right, we move to damage control, we move to preventive measures, and we also ossify them into laws because something bad happened. And this is a direct result of the adaptive responses of a predictive brain that we have evolved through biological evolution. But this is, again, a plea to think about how do we move from instinct to judgment in some ways, right? So this is Richard Levantine giving the example of the House of Lords, voting itself out of power. So he argues that we cannot just rely on genes and instinct all the time. We have to sort of accept the fact that we are conscious human beings and that we can influence our own environment, and then we can influence ourselves as to who we are as a species. So this one is personal because growing up in India, Mahatma Gandhi is a huge hero, and people would talk about how you need to be brave in the face of negative things that happen to you. And the example they give is that he had a first-class ticket on a train in South Africa, and he was thrown out of the compartment and asked to go into the van compartment. And the idea there is that then led him, to do all the things that he did and finally get independence to India. And it was kind of overwhelming when you're young, because I was ashamed of myself because I knew I would probably just move to the van compartment, right? And this idea of a heroic response was kind of confusing to me. Later on, I got to read his autobiography in his own words, and he talks about that night. And remember, this is not that Gandhi, right? This is the young barrister from England. He's not he's not the Mahatma yet there. So he describes that night when they threw the luggage out because he refused to move to the van compartment. He did do that. And then he's sitting there shivering in Maritzburg railway station. And he says, my overcoat was in my luggage, but I did not dare to ask for it lest I should be insulted again. So I sat and shivered, and it was cold because of altitude there. There was, no light in the room. A passenger came in about midnight and possibly wanted to talk to me, but I was in no mood to talk. Now this I could understand, right? And then he says, I began to think of my duty. Should I fight for my rights or go back to India? Or should I go on to Pretoria without minding the insults and return to India after finishing the case? And then he tells, it would be cowardice to run back to India without fulfilling my obligation. And that opened the door to a little bit of understanding of what courage looks like, right? When you frame the problem as, how do I fight injustice and how can I be a hero? It's a very different problem than saying, I don't want to be a coward, right? That I could understand. And the making of the Mahatma is a fascinating story because he ended up spending 20 years in South Africa. And it's a very effectual story of his working with different people, experimenting with little techniques of nonviolent protests. So by the time he got back to India, he had the toolkit and the experiences and everything ready to do this. So when we think about building institutions that are capable of courage, capable of really good decision making, we may want to think about the role of outcome bias here, right? Because we tie ourselves to some goals ahead of time, and then we are living up to certain expectations of behavior, we don't take the chance to actually change and learn along the way. And goal change is, of course, really, really hard, right? It's not like adapting to different ways to achieve the same goal. To give up what you thought was worthwhile and you want creates a lot of psychological discomfort. And this ought to be something that we want to be thinking about as well. So finally, all of this is leading up to the idea of looking at entrepreneurship as an alternative, a useful alternative, not just to, market failure and government failure and things like that, but maybe even to democracy and science as well, even though it can still build on both of those things. So around the world in history, we have combinations of capitalism and democracy, and we have also experimented with different combinations of non-capitalism and non-democracy. But the idea of the entrepreneurial method is, it is not the scientific method, but maybe we want to think about it as a method rather than just this phenomenon of starting and running companies, right? And it's not a subset of market economics or liberal democracy. So the idea here is that the first step is to see entrepreneurship as a sculptural force in history that can stand, in tandem with some of these other forces here. So, I wanted to end by just talking about, we have come far. We have learned in some ways to incorporate the invisible hand and the voices of the many with the iron fist of the state, right? So here the idea is to sort of have a co-creative embrace of uncertainty, that seeing uncertainty as an important ingredient of everything we do and not something to be afraid of and a problem to overcome. And in this process, right, chance and loss and conversations and commitments, things that are happening in the small can actually engender ways for us to build more valuable persons and societies. And so the two little examples I'm going to give you are, one, this is an unlikely story in a way of somebody who learned some of these lessons, right? This is Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw from India. Her dream was to become a Braumeister. Well, the Indian beer industry was not exactly welcoming of her, even though she was valedictorian of her class and everything. And a chance encounter with an acquaintance who introduced her to somebody from Scotland. And this guy was looking to source some biopharmaceuticals from India. And he asked her, can you make them for me? And she was already sort of depressed because the Brewmeister thing is not working out. But her instinct was, I don't know anything about it, so she declined. But with a little bit of coaxing and talking some more, she decides, okay, I will make enzymes, because I know a thing or two, and especially enzymes that are closely related to brewing. And now, unlike Jamsetji Tata, who never lived to see Tesco being even formed, she's been around a $4 billion company called Biocon. But the point here is not the value of any venture, right, whether it's successful or not, but this idea of what is worth valuing even when we cannot even dream of what that could be, right? And that's the last one I want to share with you. This is Jackie Novogratz, founder of Acumen Fund and also UVA alumna. And I'm going to directly quote her because I'd like to end the talk on an entrepreneur's words and not my words. So let's take a look at what she's saying here. If you would have asked me or any of my co-founders in 1986, when women had just gotten the right to open a bank account without their husband's signature, if you had said to us that in 30 years we wouldn't just be improving women's economic condition, which was our mission, but that a young woman in the next generation would be running the financial system, and that Rwanda would have more women parliamentarians than any country on the planet, I'm not sure we would have believed you. Maybe our dreams were too small. Thank you.
Our prize winners' research has had great impact on entrepreneurship research, but also way beyond entrepreneurship research. And I think we see today here why that is the case, why our ambition and ideas go far beyond the scope of entrepreneurship research per se. We will have a brief conversation with two talking partners for you. So we will welcome up on stage Mikael Blomqvist, a serial entrepreneur, and Lars Persson, Professor and Deputy Director of IFN. So the presentation took us a long way out, and it demonstrates the power of how your insights into how successful entrepreneurs think takes us a very long way into any question we may far beyond that specific domain. Still, of course, for this conversation, to be fair to the gentlemen, I want to bring us back somewhat to the issue of how entrepreneurs think, which was the starting point also in your work here, and reflect upon what are the characteristics of successful entrepreneurs and any common denominators that entrepreneurs and how they think that makes them successful. Mikael, as you have started a number of companies in very different settings and industries, do you have any reflections on this?
Yeah, I haven't worked that academic way. I've done more my feeling, my stomach, and but a lot of words I picked up is you have to be flexible. You have to. The mindset is very important, that you have an open-minded. If you're on that, you won't succeed. That's a short. No?
But if you are that, will you succeed?
Yes.
So you're sure about that?
Yes.
So that is a researcher's perspective, right? So I had people exactly like you, very, very experienced expert entrepreneurs in the original study. And one of the reasons we had to study this was what you think actually makes you successful may not actually work for someone else. That's the first thing, right? The second thing is the fact that we succeeded in a particular way doesn't mean that that will always lead to success. So let me tell you what you have actually learned.
Yeah, okay.
I think one of the things you are probably very good at when you think about flexibility is you have actually figured out a way to know when to be flexible and when to hold your ground as well, right? There is a certain amount of judgment that goes into that mindset that you talked about. And how do you deal with failure? Have you never had failures? Because one of the things I've learned from people like you is that they have a unique attitude towards failure.
I always forget them.
I like that. So that's a good, so this is one thing. So you always forget them, but one of the reasons you forget them is because you don't simply, cry in your beer and quit the next day.
Yeah, I don't repeat it.
You will not repeat it. So that was one of the examples that people said, I've learned that I can either succeed or I can learn, and that you can always live to fight another day. So it's just wonderful. I just wanted to push back on your thing a little bit, because as a researcher, we are always, on the one hand, enamored by the idea of success, but also we know that the success-failure question is much more difficult to understand than that, right? Yeah. Thank you for putting up with my cheekiness here.
So I would kind of focus on what you call the way to handle uncertainty, which I think is key. So it's not risk where we know the probability, success or not success, but it's something uncertain. So we have this research project at IFN where we try to see how people react to what we call business uncertainty. So you would like to understand how entrepreneurs is handling market uncertainty, rivals' response, etc. And I think that's kind of the key for successful entrepreneurship. So we have this data, which is interesting. So we have all the firms listed at the NASDAQ, and we could see the young, flourishing firms. And we have colleagues that do this text analysis. They kind of use machine learning to kind of read all the documents that these flourishing firms are delivering. And what we find that very interesting is that these firms that are young and very successful, entrepreneurial, use the word uncertainty and similar words and optimism a lot. Not risk and etc. But it's really that seems to be the key driver. So I really agree with you and the way to see that it's the way to not only handle uncertainty or risk, but be optimistic and see it as an opportunity. I think actually now listening to you even more and learn, it's really kind of catching in there with this research showing that these firms has this. When they get older, they usually lose it and discuss more about risk and other things and not optimistic anymore.
Yeah, when you have money, you can worry about risk.
Yeah, you could be disappointed. You could be disappointed. Yeah. So.
yeah. It's very interesting. But I do want to ask, why the obsession with success? So, if you remember, my original study was to truly understand expertise irrespective of success and failure. So think about this. When you think about a chess grandmaster, right? Of course, they will win every time against a novice. But if you have two chess grandmasters playing against each other, all bets are off, right? That's what makes a game interesting. So the idea of expertise is through both success and failure, what is it that you actually learn that can help you? So the idea of success is a very problematic dependent variable. Because if you only look at success, one of the things, we don't look at the people who did exactly the same thing and failed, and we don't look at people who did not do that and succeeded. So if you draw that 2 by 2, so we can get astray very quickly. But when you look at somebody who's done it for years and years and years and been through all kinds of things, whether any particular venture succeeded or not, they succeeded over multiple ventures. I find that much more interesting.
Pick up my research on, you called me the football researcher after lunch. And I love football, so
no, it's a lovely study.
Yeah. So we have this other research project at IFN. So we try to understand who becomes the superstar of something, really the best expert. So what we did then was ask the question. So there is this discussion that underdogs, in some way, people that have some difficulties and then later on become good. So the problem for us to compare this in an exogenous way. So what we did was that say one of these exogenous things in life is what month you're born in. So basically, that's a very big, being born in January or December is a very big difference because you are basically almost a year in difference in school, etc. And then we took this where we have a really good measure of who becomes the grandmaster, it's football. So we compared when you're born in the year and how good you become in football. And when we read this research, everyone said it's the January kids become the superstars because they're ahead. And this was true for juniors. But then when we're looking for the senior winning this Ballon d'Or, being the best player in the world, we plotted this very nicely and we had this very nice inverse U-shaped form. So it's the November and October kids that become the superstars. And our story, which I think Gunilla referred to and you also, is that this temporary disadvantage creates some kind of grit, some kind of way of working hard, and you could actually resist. And when you eventually overcome that, you become the superstar. And it's actually true also for CEOs and chairmen in the Swedish business sector. So some economists don't like football, and I don't know why. So we had to do it also on the business sector.
Absolutely. The way to think about it is the same thing applies to entrepreneurial success, right? I tell my students all the time, how do I succeed? Tell me how you're going to fail and what you do after you fail. Then I can tell you a little bit about how you can succeed, right? But people don't want to think about that, especially, your first venture. But the second venture, you kind of know this is coming and you know what to do. And you know how to face it, also how to forget it and keep going. So, wonderful.
The greetings from your colleagues worldwide show the power of effectuation thinking in so many different settings. But I would like to ask, does this, your work and the method prescribed by your work fit better in some countries than others, or in some settings than others? How about this setting in our country? Are Swedes more likely than others to abandon prediction as a task?
You have to first tell me what a Swede is.
Many different things.
No, because we create these categories and we say, can it work here, can it work there? And yesterday, actually, at SSC, where we were given a talk, there was one person who was saying, like, the default option is actually entrepreneurship, right? Because for most people around the world, jobs are not an option. So you are an entrepreneur, right? So the default option is entrepreneurship. So can it work better under different successes? Again, I think that question comes from what the heck is better mean? Because we're thinking about success or something like that. So here is how I will give you a very short answer for what we have learned from research, right? Doesn't matter what kind of personality you have, doesn't matter what kind of life stage you have, doesn't matter which culture you're born in as an individual, any kind of circumstances. And you can think about, you can use effectuation to build new things. Does that mean you can become the Bill Gates of Sweden, if that's your definition of success? No. Bill Gates doesn't know how he became Bill Gates, right? And even if he says he knows, I wouldn't be, I would be very skeptical. So, so the issue is not, can you use this? The question is, everybody can do it, but they can do different things with it depending on who comes on board. So the question is not how to become a successful entrepreneur or how do I build a successful venture. The question you want to ask yourself is, given who I am and what I know and whom I know, what kind of ventures can I build? And there are as many kinds of ventures out there as there are entrepreneurs. So you can always figure out the successful venture, but that will look different in different countries at different times in different places. And if you want the soundbite version of that, it is both the optimist and the pessimist can be great inventors. The optimist invents the airplane, the pessimist invents the parachutes. Now, which one makes more money? I don't care.
Thank you. Gentlemen, any reflections on that?
Yes, it's always almost the same worldwide, but there are places or countries where you have too much security around you, like Sweden, as you mentioned. They get a bit fat and happy and never take the risk.
Okay.
So that varies, but
oh, absolutely.
And that is the mindset also comes in. If you want to do something to achieve something, but it's in principle the same, but it develops different in different countries, different regions, so to say.
Actually, I agree with you, because there are ways we can kill it. So here is one of the things I want to say. So we have to distinguish. I thought Anders was asking a question about, can you do effectual entrepreneurship anywhere? And that's where I gave the answer. But can you do entrepreneurship everywhere is a different question, because in fact, I've worked with different countries around the world, and especially in Scandinavian countries in the very early stages. In fact, the first time I remember I had a last talk, Magnus Aronsson had arranged it, and somebody asked, how do we double the number of startups in Sweden? And I said, fire half your public sector. You will have entrepreneurs the next day, right? Because people will figure out a way to make a living. They will do something. So you're absolutely correct. So if we have, so this is why some of these questions about whether safety net, and it's not only whether you have the safety net, but also whether that then cues in, it kind of kills your judgment in doing things that are worth doing, but that may involve a certain amount of risk. All of those things are absolutely true. But we offer effectual entrepreneurship as an antidote. So we say, even in Sweden, right? What is your bird in hand, and what can you do given all kinds of other constraints? And that's what we used to do. I used to do workshops and things here all the time. But it does help, right? Some of the regulatory changes that you have made over time, and even in Denmark, it was a large amount of money that you needed to even get the company started. They reduced the loss on that. And I was talking with Magnus earlier on tax changes that you have made. And you have seen an increase. So we know there are lots of things regulatorily and from a policy perspective you can do to make it better. But that is no excuse. I mean, things are bad is no excuse for an effectual entrepreneur. Right?
I could fill in there. So we have this also at IFAN, this big research program on entrepreneurship. So what we did was looking at the crisis in the 90s, and I think crises sometimes are good. So this kind of created an environment where you understood that the business sector and entrepreneurship needed to be better. So we had all this Lindbeck Commission, etc., and a lot of these rules that you referred to was actually changed in the 90s. And they were most discussion is about the macro and the central bank, etc., but we believe that it was more about the incentives, the taxes, the labor market. It became much more dynamic. And actually what we did was we had this paper where we compared the dynamism of the US business sector and the Swedish one. And when we looked at how many firms has been started, how large share was created by new firms, how much of the productivity in Sweden compared to the US the last 20 years, and we found that, wow, Sweden is out-competing US.
Yep.
And we were sending these articles to US journals, and they said, no, this is not true. Sweden, it's North Korea, Colombia, Sweden, Venezuela. They say, can't be true. So we had to do all these changes and tests, etc. But eventually it actually got published, and the World Bank picked it up and discussed it. So I think it's actually, as you say, it's a combination of the humans, but it's also the institution, and it's interesting. And I usually say that actually what's important is also that we had this entrepreneurial spirit before the 70s and 80s, and we actually made this kind of experiment in the 70s and 80s. We were really entrepreneurial.
Right? You had your own arrangement.
Yeah, and then you kind of put that on, and then you lift it again, you had this really kind of explosion of entrepreneurship. So it was a combination, having this old tradition and then getting the institution right again.
Yeah, so, and that is a certain amount of envy, the fact that you are actually able to be flexible on the institutional side, right? That is a very important thing. There are many countries, even if people are agreed they want to change, they can't change this. The system change is very difficult. You guys have been pulling it off. And there's a little bit of envy there from people.
And also when we changed government, they stuck to that. And everyone asked me, why? No other country do that. So I think that was so,
But that is kind of the proof that you can get it done, right? Even at the institutional level. But it's the same mindset of flexibility and maybe also willingness to fail in some of the policy changes that you do make, right?
Excellent. At the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, we of course always want to bring insights about entrepreneurship and on entrepreneurship into policy and discussions about society we want to live in. So thank you very much for doing that with us today, all three of you. Thank you, all of you, for sharing tonight with us, celebrating entrepreneurship research and celebrating Professor Sarasvathy's research in particular. Thank you very much for coming. There will be some refreshments waiting. There will be refreshments waiting for you when you go for a beer in the bar next door, which I encourage you all to do.
And especially apologies for the longer talk and keeping you from this beautiful day that has been outside the last few days. Although today is a little cloudy, it is still beautiful, so thank you for being here.
Thank you.